Ross was being charged with 7 different offences, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and the Kingpin statutes, something which was normally reserved for cartel leaders. However, even though Ross had been caught with his fingers on the laptop whilst logged in as the admin on Silk Road, he still pled not guilty. His lawyers admitted that Ross had started the Silk Road, but claimed he had done so as a social experiment, not as a business to make money. They then said shortly after he started the site, things had begun to get a little out of control, and thus Ross had decided to sell the site to someone else, who went by the name Dread Pirate Roberts. They claimed that after that, Ross had no further involvement in the site, and that Ross was simply being set up as the fall guy by the real DPR. They argued the chat logs and diary on Ross's computer had been planted there to try and pin all the blame on him. However, unfortunately for Ross, the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had literally been caught logged into the Silk Road admin page, loaded on his laptop, whilst at the library. Not just that, the chat logs on his computer dated back multiple years, and showed everything he'd said, including the conversation with Variety Jones, where they invented the Dread Pirate Roberts name as an alibi if he was ever caught. Messages also showed DPR telling someone he was buying fake IDs because he needed to expand Silk Road's server space, and these messages were sent right at the same time that Ross's fake IDs were intercepted. As for the notion that Ross sold the sites, there was absolutely no record or indication of that. Plus, Ross had still been receiving all the Bitcoin from site commissions, so it seemed clear he was still the one who'd been running it all this time. From start to finish, Ross had been Dread Pirate Roberts. Despite this, advocates came from all over to support Ross during the trial, with many of them protesting on the steps of the courthouse that he was a hero. They said that all Ross had done was run a website, and if that was a crime, then the CEOs of eBay and Craigslist should stand trial too, as illegal goods were sold on those websites as well. The jury did not see it the same way. They returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. The chat logs and files on Ross's computer were just too damning. If he'd only closed the laptop lid when in the library, it's likely they wouldn't have been able to prove so much. Before his sentencing, Ross sent a letter to the judge, which said, "I've had my youth, and I know you must take away my middle years, but please leave me with my old age. Please leave a small light at the end of the tunnel, an excuse to stay healthy, an excuse to dream of better days ahead, and a chance to redeem myself in the free world before I meet my maker." The judge did not listen to this. Ross received 2 life sentences plus 40 years with no parole. In other words, Ross would spend the entire rest of his life in prison. Some felt this was overly harsh, but it seemed the judge wanted to make an example of him to try and deter other people from setting up similar marketplaces in future. The judge also explained her decision by saying that she disagreed with Ross's philosophy that drug use only affects those who take the drugs. She said there are many other people who are hurt because of the dangerous substances sold on Silk Road. People die and lose loved ones, families get ripped apart, junkies are created, and in many instances, addicts lose their ability to care for their children, and a generation can grow up neglected and orphaned. In other words, Silk Road caused irreparable harm to many people. The judge also pointed out that whilst no bodies had been found, Ross had commissioned 5 murders which he paid for, and he fully believed they'd taken place. Ultimately, the evidence against Ross seemed conclusive, and thus Ross was sentenced to life in jail. Of course, there's 2 sides to this. On the one hand, there have been studies that showed people were much less likely to be physically harmed buying these substances online compared to on the streets, and Ross tried to argue Silk Road actually made the experience much safer, especially with the review system on the sites. If these people were gonna buy illegal goods anyway, Silk Road was probably a much safer way to do it. Ross was also technically a first-time offender, and this was a non-violent charge, and so the life sentencing did seem unusually extreme. Because yes, Ross built the Silk Road platform, but aside from the initial shrooms he grew, he wasn't selling any drugs himself. He was a web admin, and you could argue that drug trades happen all the time on platforms like Facebook and Snapchat, but that doesn't mean the platform creator is to blame. On the other hand, there is clearly a big difference between Silk Road and those other sites. Those other sites don't allow illegal sales, whereas Silk Road actively encouraged it and made it possible. Plus, in 2015, a study from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said that for the first time in recent history, more people had died from opioid-related overdoses in America than from gun deaths. They found one of the main reasons for the rise in deaths was due to the ease in which people could now gain access to these substances. The growth in substance abuse coincided with the growth in popularity of Silk Roads. In other words, people got access to items they likely wouldn't have been able to access without Silk Road, and in multiple cases, that led to people dying. Silk Road made it easy for people of all ages to access unsafe substances and illegal goods, and Ross enabled that. In fact, he personally approved the sale of countless extremely dangerous items. However, no matter what side of the debate you fall on, you have to recognize it's not fully black and white. What does seem clear is that Ross was the creator and operator of Silk Road, and that from February 6, 2011 to July 23, 2013, it's estimated well over 1.2 million unique transactions happened on the site, and 9,519,664 Bitcoin was generated in sales. Of that, 614,305 Bitcoin was taken by Silk Road as commission. Some of that money was reinvested back into site growth, staff, and maintenance, and some of it Ross took for himself. Back in 2013, when Ross was caught, that money was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As of today, it would be worth tens of billions of dollars. It's ironic, really, that Ross was a big fan of the show Breaking Bad, as there's clearly parallels with his own story. A seemingly total normal guy who descends into becoming a drug kingpin, gradually getting more extreme along the way, like ordering a hit to get someone killed. And likewise, both started out with a more noble objective. For Walt, it was to pay his medical bills, for Ross it was to give people freedom, but both seemed to end up liking the power and wealth they gained a little too much, and they got carried away and pushed things too far, until finally, it all caught up with them. Even though the judge had expected that the sentencing she gave to Ross would deter anyone else from creating another Silk Road, in reality, almost immediately after the original Silk Road site got shut down, Silk Road 2.0 popped up. Arguably, all the attention of the Silk Road case just got more people interested in the idea. However, sequels are rarely better than the original, and indeed the multiple Silk Road sequels haven't quite gained the same notoriety as Ross's original sites. Silk Road 2 lasted exactly 1 year, before federal agents found the server hosting Silk Road 2 in a foreign country, and realized the server was registered to the email address blake@bentel.net. Turns out, a guy called Blake Bentel, who was allegedly operating the site, had used his own personal email account with his full name in to set up the server for Silk Road 2. So just like Ross's use of his personal email address led the FBI to him, the same happened with Blake. I'm still not sure why you would possibly use your real personal email address for that. Anyway, once again there was some controversy around how the authorities were able to locate this server in the first place. Some think governments used a potentially illegal spying technique, and others think the Tor network itself may be compromised. There's all kinds of theories, but none of that has stopped countless other similar dark marketplaces popping up over the last few years. Generally, as one shuts down, another one tends to open. Although quite often it turns out the entire site was a scam in the first place, or even a honeypot by the government to catch dealers. Interestingly though, many of the people who set up these Silk Road clones or similar illegal marketplaces do so under the name Dread Pirate Roberts. So in a way, Ross's vision of a free market that would live on and be passed down from person to person did kind of happen. Although, since Ross is facing the rest of his life in prison, I doubt that's much consolation. Now, if you found this story of Silk Road interesting, I think you're really going to enjoy this video I made about Mark Zuckerberg's enemy, the Bitcoin billionaires. This video looks at the rise of Bitcoin, including its ties to Silk Road.